Okay. All right. Thank you for your patience. I think we can begin. Welcome, everyone. I'm Professor Matthew Hendig from the History Department, and I'd like to welcome you to the Fall 2022 edition of the Alden Scholar Series. The Alden Scholar Series is now in its 10th year. It began in 2012 as a collaboration between the History Department and the library to showcase book-length studies written by SUNY Oneonta faculty members within the past 5 years. And we're very pleased that this fall's Alden Scholar will be Dr. Sheena Mason from the Department of English. I wanted to mention a couple announcements, give some thanks, and introduce Dr. Mason, and then we'll begin. So for announcements, please remember to leave any food and drink you have outside of this room. This is a special collections room, so there's precious things here, as well as ideas. So please put any food and drink on the table outside the door. We have a guest book that has been set up on that round table, so please sign the guest book on your way out. Everyone should have a little comment card on their seat, and the committee collects these and looks at the information within them. So please try to fill them out before you're done, and there's a box on the round table to deposit them in. We should note that copies of Dr. Mason's book, The Theory of Racelessness, are available for purchase. And you can talk to Mr. Darren Lyons if you're interested in purchasing one after the talk. I'd like to thank all the members of the Alden Scholars Committee. We have a very good team that works pretty seamlessly together, including Professor Meta Harder, Jennifer Jensen, Mary Lynn Benson, Heather Stalter, Mark Ferrara, and Professor George Hovis. I want to give a thanks to Darren Lyons from the OAS for arranging to have copies of the book for sale, which isn't always easy to do, so I appreciate that. Thanks to Mark English and the IT people for helping set up our technology. Thanks to Laura Lincoln for facilitating the simulcast of this talk for alumni. And thanks to Darren Chase, the library director, for helping give us the use of this space and make arrangements for reception afterwards. Heather Stalter and a student helper, Mary Nugent, have created a very nice display outside the room here. So on your way out, take a look. There's some interesting books arranged that might give you further ideas of things to read. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Sheena Mason. In 2021, Dr. Mason joined the faculty at SUNY Oneonta as an assistant professor of English. Her book, Theory of Racelessness, A Case for Anti-Racism, presents her signature theory of racelessness, which she describes as a framework for talking about, teaching about, studying, identifying, solving, and resolving the causes and effects of racism. Her forthcoming publications include chapters such as Black liberation movements in the Cambridge Companion to 20th Century American Novel and Politics, another chapter, The Harlem Renaissance, an interpretation of racialized art and ethics, the Oxford Handbook of Art and Ethics, chapter, Re-envisioning Unalignment and Freedom, Insurrectional Ethics in Marlon James' book of the Night Women, which is an anthology, and another work, The Unknown World, Edward Jones' Exploration of America's Racialist Ideology in All on Hager's Children, which is in the Journal of the Short Storied English. She's hard at work on a second book, framed for a broader audience, entitled Racismlessness, Making a Limitless Future Together, which should be released next year. And we should note that her work has earned support from various sources, including the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, which has helped her support the development of a whole e-learning program for those who want to engage and learn about her theory and see how it applies to numerous fields. So on that note, I will turn the floor over to Professor Mason, and we will very much look forward to hearing her talk.
I am not at all nervous, which means I'm 100% terrified. So now that we have that out of the way, I'm really, really excited. In addition to being terrified, I'm really excited to share my work with you on campus. This is really the first time I'm being able to do this, and I don't take that for granted. You could be doing anything, you could be anywhere, but you're here with me, so thank you so much. I want to shout out a lot of my former students whose artwork is going to be featured in many of my slides. In my classes, the literature classes, I have students create artwork for their final projects. Those pieces of art then get exhibited in an open project gallery space in our fine arts department once a year, and I'm really, really enamored with my students, and they learn the theory of racistness, and so I see their artwork as ultimately reflective of that which I'm talking about today, both the benefit, the value, and the necessity of working within such a framework. And also Donna Dushanis, who's a graphic artist I'm collaborating with on a graphic novel adaptation of my second book. Her artwork through memes are also going to be featured here. Now, who am I? So my story is long and winding, but I want to talk a bit about my experiences with explicit racism, because this topic of the day is indeed racism and anti-racism. When I was about 8 years old, I learned that I was Black. My adoptive mother told me that my adoptive father's family didn't like me or her because she was brown and I was Black. And I have this distinct memory of looking at my arms like so, and just being fascinated and wondering, what does it mean to be Black? And also, why would anyone not like me because I'm Black? Fast forward a few years, when I'm about 13 or so, I'm a middle schooler, I'm on the school bus, and a new kid to the school arrived and started taunting me. There has to be a way to mute this.
We can just say, if you are online, oh, you just mute.
That might do it as well, just in case, we'll see. So I'm on the school bus and a new student shows up and starts calling me pubic hair repeatedly, taunting me, calling me pubic hair. And for about a week, I suffered her taunting, her abuse. And on the last day that I saw her, she grabbed my ponytail and she physically assaulted me. And I remember feeling not only helpless, but also wondering why the school bus driver didn't appear to be cognizant of the fact that I'm getting assaulted on the school bus, didn't say anything as I got off the school bus. And when I got off the bus at the middle school, this person had to continue riding to the high school. And I heard the sound of somebody hawking a loogie, which, if you don't know what a loogie is, it's the biggest glob of spit you can imagine. I heard that sound, and just as I turn around, I see the spit coming from the bus window and landing in my hair. And the student had spit on me. Now, that student was dismissed from the school, ultimately transferred to a different school, but let that sink in for a moment, right? You're 13, you're in middle school, and you experience this. Around the same time, my brother and a neighbor were playing in our trailer park where I grew up, and he comes home screaming bloody murder. He comes in the door screaming, and everyone is alarmed, like, what's happening, what's going on? Come to find out, an alleged skinhead in the trailer park shot a gun at my brother and our classmate. And that was a traumatizing thing, right? Because it was evident that racism was part of that. But the messaging that I received as a kid was that there was actually something wrong with me. It's because I'm Black that other people hate me, or that other people are violent towards me in one way or the other. So by the time I'm in undergrad at SUNY Plattsburgh, I'm 100% obsessed with understanding everything to do with racism. And I saw African-American literature as an in to that world, to understanding what is racism, how has it looked historically, what is it today. And I felt through the literature that has been consistently defined as always having to do with race and racism, a certain amount of resilience and tenacity that I saw in myself, and a resistance to the effects of and the causes of racism. And I wanted to be a part of that. And more specifically, I wanted to be part of the solution-making effort that I saw the book, the history of African American literature in particularly participating in. And so I studied everything African American literature. And when I found myself to be a PhD student at Howard University, having just graduated in May 2021, my obsession remained. And I found myself going on what can be best described as an emotional, spiritual, and intellectual journey, such that I couldn't have possibly anticipated, but in hindsight makes perfect sense. And the subject of my dissertation, which turned into my first book, was the result of my continued 20-year study of all things to do with race and racism. There are happy endings to my story. I am married now. That's me and my wife in the top right corner, looking fabulous on our wedding day. We're all black. Those are our triplets who are 3 years old. This picture is a year old. The loves of my life. My boys are identical twins, Josiah and Skylar, and my baby girl, Tatiana. I'm also a member of a sorority, Sigma Gamma Rho. That's me with my line sisters there. And that's the picture of my favorite place on Howard's campus, the library, of course. And in the center, having come full circle with my journey to what I now consider racelessness, a brochure, an image of a brochure, my first conference that I facilitated recently in Boston with Dr. Carlos Hoyt and Greg Thomas, Resolving the Racism Dilemma. And that is what brings me here in front of you today. I am 100% investing my life's purpose, my journey to resolving the racism dilemma, which seems like a bold and lofty goal, certainly, but it's one that I'm committed to because I do believe that it is my life's purpose to do this type of work, and that's why I'm here with you today. I want to share just one review of the Theory of Racistness, the first book, that might illuminate a bit about what's in the book, and also how people are receiving and thinking about the book. And actually, this is from a dear colleague, Dr. George Hovis, a professor of English, who wrote, "Those of us who have grown proud of our ability to do anti-racist work in the classroom will find humility encountering Sheena Mason's theory of racistness. Mason asks us to throw out the familiar script and join a conversation that is suddenly fresher, broader, and even more challenging. This is absolutely necessary reading." You didn't hear from me, you heard from him. Before I get any further, I want to invite you to reflect on how you define these terms coming into this talk today. Race, racialization, racism, and racelessness. Now, if you are like me and you want to take notes and you want to write out your definitions, that's fine. If you don't have a writing utensil and paper to write on, feel free to take notes on your phone. And if you just want to do a sort of mental check and think, this is how I define race for myself, right? This is how I define racialization, racistness, and racism, then that's fine too. So let's take 90 seconds together to do that work. Hopefully those of you using technology are not going to Google. All right. Hopefully you've at least gotten far enough to get your wheels really turning to asking yourself these questions of how do you define these terms? And hopefully at the conclusion of this talk, you'll have a clear understanding of how I define the terms. And maybe that will or won't inspire you to think more deeply about how you define these terms ultimately. Because if we're sincere about what can be called our anti-racist efforts, then to some extent, we have to be on the same page, right? We can have differing views, different philosophies, different theories, but in terms of strategy, I think it's safe to say that we need something that is ultimately cohesive and working in tandem in order to get the sort of results that we all deserve, that the future generations deserve, and that future generations after that deserve. So I invite you to think about, as I proceed, keeping in mind the definitions that you were able to write, and ask yourself the following questions. Have you been working against racism in ways that unintentionally help to maintain it? Is that in part because of how you've learned to define these four terms? One analogy my students use after engaging with the theory is that of the Matrix. If you're familiar with the movie The Matrix, if you're unfamiliar, I strongly suggest watching it. If you're unfamiliar, you're in this sort of virtual reality, right? And the protagonist, the main character, Neo, gets out of the virtual reality to recognize that, hey, I was actually in the Matrix, right? And then now, being cognizant of the facts that I'm in the Matrix, I can decide which path I want to go on. Do I want to stay in the Matrix because it's cozy and comfy there? Or do I want to free myself from those strictures and live fully in capital R reality? I imagine you to consider whether or not you're in a Matrix. And if you're in a Matrix, as it pertains to how you think about race, racism, etc., then how might you get out of the Matrix? Or do you want to stay in the Matrix, right? Does that just seem like the easier path, the more practical path? And if you want to get out, how might you help other people out of the Matrix as well, if at all? Now, it's important to know what I'm not saying. I'm saying that almost everyone gets this wrong as it pertains to race and racism. Colorblindness is the belief that we can see something about ourselves and each other, that we can translate into race, that we can then ignore in order to treat people better, right? That's the general ethos of colorblindness. The theory of racistness intervenes into this ethos to say, actually, that translation of how a person looks, of ancestry and DNA, is a mistranslation that in actuality allows racism, which hides its face as race, to continue to persist. And it's our belief in race that ultimately, I guess that's our answer. It's our belief in race that ultimately is the problem. And until we can tend to the actual problem, the root cause of the problem, then we cannot simply ignore and should not ignore what race is and what we believe that race is. And fundamentally, part of the problem that and the criticism of colorblindness includes the fact that in an effort to not see race, to be race blind is a synonym for colorblindness, ultimately it results often in people not seeing racism anywhere, which is also hugely problematic, right? And since I came in the door and started this presentation, I've been talking about racism. So the theory of racistness is not advocating for the ignoring, obscuring, or anything else like that of racism. In fact, it's inviting us and enabling us to see more clearly what the problems are, and importantly, how to get to the other side of those problems. I just want to give a brief overview of my first book so you get a sense for the scholarship, the knowledge that goes behind this theory that then has a broader applicability, which I'll talk about after I summarize the book. So in the first chapter, the introduction, Theory of Racistness, a methodological and pedagogical framework, I lay the foundation for the theory of racistness. The theory of racistness is a methodological and pedagogical framework for analysis that illustrates how the undoing of racism requires the undoing of our belief in race. It inspires a more astute identification and analysis of racism and stops unintentionally reifying racism by upholding race ideology and its corresponding language. The theory of racistness is also a philosophy of race that extends and explores the boundaries of racial skepticism and delineates clearer paths towards racial eliminativism, both of which I'll talk about shortly. The theory of racistness reflects two philosophical positions on race that are uncommonly taught and commonly misunderstood. Skepticism, the belief that race does not exist in nature, and eliminativism, the position that the concept of race, whatever it is, should be eradicated from human society. After I define and name the core tenets of the theory, I present a brief overview of philosophies of race with examples found both within and outside of African American literary studies. In Chapter 2, African American Literature and Anti-Racist Practices, I provide a brief history of how African American literature and its study have come to be defined across time and through various literary movements. I examine the history of how the production and persistence of racism during any given period influenced and inspired what was accepted or branded within the category of African American literature, and how the literature was and remains canonized and taught. Critically, I consider the significance of the writers and texts that remain uncanonized, or that which were and are intentionally thrown into non-canonical dustbins, and I call for a reimagining or reinterpretation of canonical writers and texts from an eliminativist skeptical position or an eliminativist social constructionist position, terms that will become more familiar after today's talk. In Chapter 3, Theory of Racistness in Literary Studies, the literal absence of race versus the figurative presence of color, I present and engage a literary theory inspired by Barbara Chase-Rabeau's sculpture, The Albino, pictured here, and also her poem titled The Albino, excerpts of which I have on the screen there. And I examine the genealogies of race making, especially as it relates to the literal racistness of humans. And I use the term walking negative to describe moments of the literary undoing of metaphysical or figurative race and color that corresponds with the character's literal absence of race. Ultimately, the engagement of the walking negative literary theory in Nella Larson's Quicksand, Francis E. W. Harper's Iola Leroy, and Chase-Rabeau's Sally Hemings results in the scrutinization of each American's will to classification, sleights of hand when racism turns into race, and moments when race ceases to exist metaphorically and literally, resulting in a sort of walking negative. In Chapter 4, Toni Morrison's Marathon Run Home in Song of Solomon, Recitative in Paradise, I map the evolution of Morrison's imaginings of home over the course of her body work. I identify and interpret the architecture of Morrison's literary houses, redesigned and rebirthed from America's racialist house into homes, identifying these sites as illustrative of Morrison's imagining of freedom, a world in which race outside of the singular human race does not exist. Certain texts, times, and interviews reflect Morrison's Reconstructionist position and others her eliminativist position. As a representative author of racistness, Morrison's entire body of work reflects the variety of ways a single writer philosophizes race and racialist art over their lifetimes. In Chapter 5, Theory of Racistness Cutting Through the Madness Created by Racism, I offer an imagined course on African American literature that is comprised of units on architecture, madness, diaspora, and nation. Framing the unit on architecture as the bones of the course, I use Architecture, Madness, and Twilight as analytical tools to bring to the surface the philosophies of race through novels like Junot Diaz's The Brief Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, Percival Everett's Erasure, and Gail Jones's Corregidora. Students will be encouraged to imagine a home in which racism does not dominate and will analyze philosophies of race that are uncommonly, if ever, taught. In conjunction with what they learn through fiction, they can then reflect on their own philosophies of race more clearly. And in the conclusion, Imagining a Post-Racist Nation, I demonstrate my intellectual and emotional journey that led up to my case for anti-racism and this theory of racistness. As I was saying earlier, it hasn't actually been an easy journey to get to where I am intellectually and emotionally about this topic. But once I was able to unlock whatever piece of the puzzle was missing in my imagination, I've been unstoppable. And I've been firm in my convictions that my conclusions are indeed valuable and correct. In my second book, which is a book for everyone, unlike the first, which is admittedly an academic book, I demonstrate the fruitfulness of questioning everything that comes primarily through applying the theory of racistness outside of literary studies. I show the theory in application while explaining each tool and concept of the theory, and each chapter builds on the other in chronological order and out of order as the following tools of the theory presented in the first book. The tools are architecture, madness, Twilight, The Walking Negative, Rememory, Invisible Ink, Consolation, Maternal Energy, Diaspora, Nation, and Home. Ultimately, the second book, Theory of Racistness, pushes to logical conclusions or logical ends, if you will, my philosophy of race, and also becomes and reflects my philosophy of culture, ethnicity, and nation. The theory of racistness is a framework for talking, teaching, thinking about, solving, and resolving racism. It has core tenets, meaning it has core rules, and underpinning philosophies of race as well as tools that if any one of us learns, we can then reap the benefits. And part of reaping the benefits would be stopping the cause of racism in its tracks, as well as suffering less the detrimental effects of racism when it does happen. The core rules of the theory of racistness are as follows. Race does not exist in nature. Race does not exist as a social construction. Everyone is raceless. Racism includes the belief in race as biological or construction and the practice of racialization. And racism is not everywhere and is not the cause for every perceived racial disparity or negative interaction. And finally, that racism can be overcome. Today, I'm giving you a very high-level overview of the knowledge and philosophies that underpin and inform the theory. And my objective isn't to persuade you to abandon how you've learned to see yourself in the world. Rather, I aim to open the door to the possibilities, to our limitlessness, and the future-making potential of racistness when properly understood within the context of the theory. I strive to create and illuminate a bridge that can exist between how any of us thinks about race, racism, and anti-racism for the betterment of us all. In true English doctorate fashion, I made up words. Oh, I didn't get the laugh out of me. Maybe because it's true. So I made up words, which of course, visually they work, but you have to generally see these words in writing to grasp what's being communicated. It doesn't translate audibly, which is something that I'm working on. The words I coined include racialist, which I write this way to signify the sameness of that which is racial and that which is racist. Racism, anti-racism, again, showing the interconnectedness of that which is perceived to be race and that which is racism. Erase and erasure, these terms were inspired by my reading of Percival Everett's book Erasure, where he shows how the imposition of authenticity and representation as it pertains to so-called Blackness actually results in the erasure of who and how people actually are in the real world, outside of the strictures of racism. As I continue to speak, I want you to imagine every time you hear one of those words, if you can, try to get the signs, try to get the spelling in your mind, and just imagine that that's what I'm actually communicating, that's how I'm saying it. Now, race isn't and has never been just skin color or phenotype, some immutable characteristic. If it were, then race wouldn't be something that we talk about more and more and more and more incessantly, decade after decade, century after century, right? Because it would just be how people are. I think even on a sort of intuitive level, many of us understand the interconnectedness of that which is race and that which is racism, which is why we tend to talk about race a lot, if we're doing anti-racism a lot. But race isn't skin color or phenotype. It's not some arbitrary categorization. In Reflection, Race and the Human, Charles Mills, a philosopher, posits that, quote, race, whether formally designated as such or not, generally comes to signify the fully human and the subhuman, whether genuinely within the human community or outside. The subhuman is actually not human at all, end quote. Race often is the hierarchy. It is the attending racism that gets carried on by our continued belief in and upholding of race and racialist ideology. In the first book, I apply the theory of racistness and show how, more often than not, race translates into both the causes and effects of racism itself. So when I say that race doesn't exist in nature or as a social construction, I mean that black and white, when applied to humans, do not exist outside of racism itself. And that is the pernicious aspect of this camouflaging. Race, according to Mills, puts into question the full humanity of the stigmatized racial groups. When best understood, our imposition and presumption of race results in our sometimes unintentional maintenance of a hierarchy, a dehumanization of one another. Racism is a social construction that necessitates our continued and mostly blind belief in and upholding of race ideology and its correlated language and practices. We just continue to fool ourselves into thinking that race is just skin color, phenotype, DNA, ethnicity, or culture. Racism includes and often masquerades as what people believe is race and the practice of racialization. Racism hides its face as race. Dehumanization results with the imposition and presumption of race in the first place because race is the dehumanization of humans. Racialization in every context arises out of the interaction of one group with another that it dominates and assigns a racial identity for the purpose of continued domination and social exclusion. Across human history, people have concocted the idea of race and subsequent identities to reflect and maintain existing or desired divisions. In time, differently racialized groups often come to embrace their racialization for a variety of complex reasons that can be conscious or even subconscious. But race, regardless, is always the dehumanizing apparatus. And that we inherited our belief in race isn't reason enough for us to continue our belief in race. Regardless of one's racialization, we each inherit and also get assigned from the outside a racial identity that we then must navigate and reconcile with who and how we actually are, especially in relationship with each other. And infrequently do people push back against their racialization from outside of it. An obviously ineffective and harmful strategy, though it's probably not obvious. As a strategy for resistance, most people accept their racialization even as they reject the negative effects of racialization. Racial equality is an oxymoron. Inequality is baked into the design of race, or that which is dubbed as racial. Therefore, racial equality can never be achieved. Sometimes people hear what I say and they mistranslate it into me wanting to skip to the good part. There's this video that went viral of Morgan Freeman, who is talking about Black History Month, and he responds to the interviewer saying that you stop calling me a black guy and I'll stop calling you a white guy. People want to skip to the good part. The theory of racistness holds that we can't just skip to the good part, because if we continue to ignore race, because racism is there hiding its face, then racism will always persist. But how we've been trying to overcome and end racism keeps us in the constant antagonistic position of fighting against racism, right? Or ignoring it. In either way, racism persists and is maintained. The theory of racistness helps people use more apt and precise language when talking about race and racism in classrooms or outside of classrooms in order to recognize oneself outside of the strictures that racism creates for all of us, to recognize each other outside of those strictures, to really effectively center our shared humanity. And as it stands, because we continue to operate within racialized frameworks, we're actually precluding some people from recognizing shared humanity of some other people. Now, mythologies of race have been used to maintain various systems of enslavement, from serfdom in Europe and Russia, to debt slavery in Africa and Europe, prisoners of war, global, and to chattel slavery, to human trafficking, to humans across the globe have demonstrated their ability and willingness to do the inexcusable and unspeakable to each other, even as people do wondrous things together. We use almost any excuse to divide ourselves from ourselves, whether it be religion, economic class, social class, nation, ethnicity, proximity, profit, and so on. But we also show a resilience and a tenacity, an ability to unify and love that proves to be an unbreakable aspect of humanity too, and that's what I cling to, that's what I hold on to. I believe that if we approach the topic of racism from a framework like the theory of racistness, we can actually do the unifying, healing work that is required in order to get to the other side of that which is racism. And we can become infinitely more clear-eyed about the problems that plague our society that many of us in this room care about and want to address. We just haven't necessarily been able to get to the point of addressing it in more effective ways. Race has been transformed from the realm of fiction into a phenomenon that most people believe exists in some meaningful way, from something biological to something socially constructed. Now, in the US, we need language and frameworks like the theory to stop the machinery of racism and enable us to create the limitless future-making potential that we want, not just for ourselves, but certainly for future generations. Because the color-coded racialization that has happened in the US and continues to happen is pernicious. And so long as we continue to participate in it and uphold it and maintain it, then the design of racialization will have its way with us. And the design of racialization in any context is division, fear, death, angst, anger, right? Misery. If you think about how during World War II, the Nazis racialized Jews as inferior beings of people, of humans. And in that way, they used that racialization as an attempt to justify the attempted annihilation of the Jews. If you look at Rwanda, you have the Rwanda genocide, and the Hutus and the Tutsis, the TWAs, they racialized the Tutsis and use that racialization as a reason for the genocide of those people. In the Dominican Republic, the Dominican Party racializes the Haitians and uses that racialization as a means to justify the Haitian genocide. In the US, how we do racialization is the sort of black and white way that we tend to think about race, primarily. But pick any race category in the US that's on the census, that's how you tend to know. Pick any race category and do your analysis of it, and you will come to find every single racialization is connected with an attempt of the government, right, of the truly elite to divide and conquer. And there is nothing inherently positive about the practice of racialization, again, in any context. And that it doesn't exist the same way everywhere else gives me also hope that it doesn't have to continue to be the way that it is now, even though it does feel like we're really, really, really entrenched. That does bring me to philosophies of race, which ultimately become very significant within the framework of the theory and significant in identifying alternative paths forward. In the field of philosophy, there's a specialization called philosophy of race. And philosophers say that there are three philosophies of race that speak to what a person thinks race is, and there are three philosophies of race that speak to what a person thinks should be done with race. Now, we do get sort of defaulted into 4 of these 6 philosophies of race. The first philosophy is naturalism. If you're a naturalist about race, you do believe it's biological. You believe that there's something in your blood, in your DNA, that makes you fill in the blank race. Constructionism, the second category. If you're a constructionist about race, you believe that race is socially constructed. And the third category that speaks to the first philosophy that connects with the theory is skepticism. If you are a skeptic about race, you say that race doesn't exist, full stop. And the 3 categories that speak to what a person thinks should be done with race include conservationism. Conservationists are usually naturalists about race. If you're a conservationist, you want to keep it, whatever it is. Reconstructionism. Reconstructionists are usually constructionists about race. And the belief is we can transmute, transform, we can reconstruct whatever race is for whatever reason. And then the 6th and last category is eliminativism. And that's the second meaning of racistness in the context of the theory. If you are an eliminativist about race, you're probably a skeptic, but you can be a constructionist about race and be an eliminativist. And ultimately you contend that whatever race is, the concept of race, it should be thrown into the dustbins of forgotten history. And in that way, racistness is aspirational. One analogy some people engaged in my work made between skepticism and constructionism to highlight the difference, because at first it can be tenuous to understand what is the difference. Skepticism is much like atheism. Atheists would readily recognize that people believe in a god or gods. They organize their entire societies around it. They have places of worship, right? They have practices, traditions, holidays. But for an atheist, that doesn't make God or gods real. As a race atheist, as somebody has dubbed it, as a racial skeptic, I recognize that most people believe in the fiction of race. And most people believe in the fiction of race, so much so that it orders and dictates a lot of our lives. But that doesn't make race real for me, because every time I see race, you can point to anything and say, but what about this, Dr. Bass? I can translate what you're pointing to and say that's what you're actually talking about there is culture, or what you're actually talking about there is ethnicity, or social class, economic class, or racism itself. And that racelessness translator is the primary tool of the theory. It's an analytical tool that helps people stop mistranslating everything into race, right? Because that mistranslation then enables and allows for the racism to continue to hide its face and persist. Infrequently, people engage with anti-racist discourse in the ways that I'm talking about here. From outside of the strictures of racism to be more clear-eyed and astute about what racism and the practice of racialization actually are. And yet, some of the most prominent historical figures like Elaine Locke or Martin Luther King Jr. or Malcolm X or James Baldwin or Toni Morrison, who I mentioned earlier, Zora Neale Hurston, these figures had skeptical eliminativist philosophies of race at some point in their life, usually toward the end. Right before Malcolm X is killed in his autobiography, he has this sort of breakthrough moment in terms of how he sees the problem of racism. And I don't think it's coincidental that he died. If we want to free ourselves from the straitjacket of misdefinition of racism, then really what's required is an engagement with these alternative philosophies of race as I've laid them out, skepticism and eliminativism. And we can do that even if we're not skeptics. We can do that even if we're not eliminativists. Let's offer, at minimum, a different toolkit, or as many toolkits as we can to folks, right, who are sincere about ending the problem of racism. As a framework, the theory does help people become infinitely more clear-eyed about what racism is and what it isn't, and importantly, how to stop it. Part of the necessary work of the theory is that of translating what appears to be race into more apt language through the racistness translator. The more apt language, at this point, I've identified a handful of categories, right? Culture, ethnicity, social class, economic class, and racism itself. Imagine we're in a Scooby-Doo episode and we're chasing after the villain and the villain is race. I don't know, a black and white mask split down the middle, right? We catch the villain, got him. Then we demask him, because that always happens in Scooby-Doo. Demask him. And he pops into 5 different people, right? One representing culture, ethnicity, class, both classes, economic and social, and racism itself. That's the sort of translation that's necessary in order to move in a more generative path forward. And that's something that the theory of racistness brings to the table. Now, in closing, I want to leave you with some student reflections, one student's reflection. After one semester with this student, I reached out and I said, hey, would you be willing to answer some questions about the theory of racistness? Because I wanted to see, as I continue developing the theory, how students actually receive what I'm teaching, right? I think that's really critical and reflective of if this is a success or if it's a miss, a bop or not. I'm hip, I know. So, the student wrote 7 pages in response to my questions. But have no fear, I'm not going to read the 7 pages. I'm just going to read an excerpt from the story. So she wrote, the theory of racistness is not as scary as it may sound. Racistness pertains to you identifying as having no race, but the theory in which it is situated has a profound implication, much more than race or what it means to be racialized itself. Removing your race, you may assume that you are removing your culture, history, past, ancestors, and the community you are situated within now. But this is simply not true. In fact, you are more so embodying your individual characteristics that represent your culture in its truest sense, instead of some watered down version of it, which race does. Race waters you down to a category that does not account for your true family and your true history. It brings you and those who may physically look like you to this one simplified narrative that doesn't even account for a fraction of who you are, what you think, and what you believe. This brainwashing process seeps into us individuals and makes us miscategorize ourselves, which is always more powerful and dangerous to the status quo than someone else doing it for you. I also wanted to share a song that a student created in response to James Baldwin's Going to Meet the Man, because I think that it reflects the type of learning that happens in my classrooms with the theory of racistness at play. And the lyrics of this song illustrate and reflect, I think, what is at the core, learning the sort of core outcome of engaging with the theory. It's not, as this student said, as scary of a thing as it may sound. So if you would humor me and take a listen, it's 2 minutes long. Now, this student wrote, produced, recorded this song as part of their final project. And I'm hoping the volume is going to be sufficient. Of course, I think I have it on mute.
Footsteps covering ground. You try to silence the sound. But who are you? What lies deep down? I'm going to make you free. Eventually, I'm going to save your life once I save mine. We bury to hide from. But can you hide from? Who are you walking above ground? I'm going to face myself and no one else. I'm going to find and see all parts of me. Going to meet the man. I'm going to meet the man. I'm going to meet the man.
When it's unspoken.
I'm going to meet. I'm going to meet. I'm going to meet.
Of life and of themselves.
Meet.
So reflecting on those lyrics and the reason why that final project is especially meaningful to me, right? She sings about, can you hide from you? I'm going to meet the man, I'm going to meet the man, I'm going to meet me, right? There's this sort of ability to see oneself in anyone else, right? And to see anyone else in oneself. And in some ways, what we're seeing in terms of the political and cultural and social landscape of the United States is an inability to see other people in yourself, or to see yourself in other people. And that's first and foremost one of the signals to me that how we are trying to do this, like how we're trying to solve the problem of racism or address it, or acknowledge it and transcend it, stop it, etc., is deficient, because it's not doing the thing that many people are convinced that it's doing. And it's not doing it because if you understand what race is truly, and you understand what the practice of racialization is and the impact that it has, and you understand how in the United States, Blackness, a category of race, was written to be outside of that which is human, then you understand how in 2022, if we continue to embrace that language and the practice of racialization and believe in race, then we are doing ultimately ourselves a significant disservice, because we cannot decouple the dehumanization that comes with how people get categorized. We can't decouple it. We can't reconstruct it. We've been trying to reconstruct race in the United States since before the United States became the United States, right? At the earliest stages of this country, the concept of race was taken, the language that we now associate it with it and have ever since was taken, and used as a tool to reflect and maintain the hierarchy that was already on the ground, the hierarchy being chattel slavery, right? And so although it makes perfect logical sense that we inherit this way of seeing and being, and that every generation has tried to fight against racism from within the confines of race itself and the confines of racialization, the very design of the tool, of the apparatus, is such that we cannot reconstruct it to be something positive when that's not what race and racialization is. It's never going to be a positive thing. It's losing battle. And I actually have more hope that we can go toward a future of racistness together, right? Sooner than we can actually reconstruct the thing called race. Because in our continued attempt to reconstruct the thing called race, we're just reconstructing racism, right? We're just making it change its face. And in that way, you know, I think it was Einstein who said something like the definition of madness is doing the same thing more than once and expecting a different result. Thank you for confirming. Yeah, that's what we've been doing. So I actually think it's an impossible project to continue doing what we've been doing, right, and expecting a different end. We have nothing to lose by going in a completely different and radical and revolutionary future, and that is my life's purpose and journey. This is the conclusion of my formal presentation. The next screen, I do have some QR codes with some resources that you're not going to want to leave without. But since I don't want everyone to pull out their cell phones just yet, I'm not going to bring up the last slide. But if I forget, feel free somebody to shout, hey, I want those resources, and I'll go to the next slide. But in the meantime, I really would welcome your questions. Thank you very much. You're very kind, thank you. Yes, Roberto, hi.
Hi, thank you for your talk and helping understand your theory better. So I have a few questions. The first is on the philosophies of race and your distinction between the constructivist and the skeptic, right? Because as I understand, the constructivist is also arguing that race is not real, right? That it is a myth, that it is a made-up idea, right? That certain meanings have been attached to that idea. And part of calling something a social construction is to be skeptical about the alleged fixity or groundedness of those meanings that are attached to X construction, right? So the social construction is about calling attention to those assumptions of fixed meanings between a category and the meanings, right? And so you call out that fixed meaning by calling it a construction, right? A made up idea. So you're sort of skeptical of what's assumed there, right? So I don't know if we can sort of talk about that difference a little bit more, right? To kind of provide an example, right? Hunger it's what's real, but food will be the social construction, right? Because, right, the skeptic will to say that only X qualifies as food will be the essentialist, right? Fix a meaning, and the skeptic has to be, I'm skeptical that only this qualifies as food. We all feel hungry naturally when we don't have nourishment, but when we say what qualifies as food depends on different cultures and different meanings, right? So you have to be skeptical to anybody that says only this qualifies as food. No, food is a social construction, right? Because there's no fixed meaning between X item and food. Some people say chickens are food, some people say cats are food, some people say crickets are food, right? What's food? It's actually a social construction made by humans in particular time and spaces. Hunger is the real thing. So what's the relationship here then, or the difference between the skeptic and the social constructionist, right? They are also saying, yes, what's race has functioned like food is, right? It has changed over time, its meaning, but ultimately it's an idea that was constructed by humans for particular purposes. And so they're not necessarily saying that it's real, right? They're agreeing that it's not real. There's no fixed meaning to this thing. And so what do we do about it? We might want to give it a different meaning or think of other ways to conceptualize what's happening here. I don't know if that is making sense.
Makes perfect sense.
Okay.
Thank you first for coming and thank you for your question. Yeah, so this is, I think, one of the places where people find difficulty in really understanding what the difference is between skepticism and constructionism. That's a common hang-up, if you will, not in a pejorative sense, but it's hard conceptually to understand. Frankly, I didn't understand the difference. I would say the words, like I would say the official definitions as was taught to me, but I didn't understand until I found myself a skeptic. But as a constructionist, now, my whole life, I've told you, this has been an emotional, spiritual, and intellectual journey. So I've inhabited all of the philosophies of race, all the way to skeptical eliminativism, which is where I am now. So again, I can appreciate the fact that it's like, I don't get it, right? What's the difference? The best way I can say it is social constructionists, I think there's a misunderstanding of what it is for something to be a social construction, which is kind of the starting point of the problem. A lot of people, when I talk about racism, will say race isn't real, it's a man-made construct, right? Well, newsflash, then it's real. If humans made it, if they constructed it, then it is a real phenomenon. It's just that a constructionist would readily recognize it's not biologically real. It is something that man made, right? And for a skeptic, I contend that it's not real at all. There's no disclaimer or extra sentence or, like footnote. It's not real, period. And although I can appreciate and I welcome the desire to really understand and grapple with the distinctions, I would say that ultimately the skepticism is important as a tool of strategy in the theory, but one needn't be a skeptic to introduce that or to explore skepticism, certainly, as I wasn't initially a skeptic and I was exploring all of this. And the more essential part is the eliminativism, because you can be a constructionist about race, but still try to destroy the category, whatever you think that it is, right? Whether you think that it's real or not is a sort of secondary issue in some ways, even though I think exploring skepticism actually makes it easier to get to eliminativism. As a strategy, I think it's important. It's not necessary. And as you're describing it, reconstructionism comes almost 9 times out of 10 out of a constructionist positionality. And the distinction between me being a skeptic and teaching about race and racism is I'm firmly outside of racialization and the strictures. I see myself as raceless, which is in this case is only an absence of the violence of racism. And I invite people who are learning with me to see themselves as essentially raceless as well. But most constructionist positionalities require people to be in the confines that they're trying to critique, right? That they're trying to interrogate, that they're trying to illuminate, which I see as a hindrance toward the aim of anti-racism. Because if you see yourself, right, real or not, in the confines, if you see yourself as a fill-in-the-blank race person, then it's no wonder that each of us has different thresholds then for talking about racism, for addressing racism, for tending to racism, for solving racism. We each have different thresholds. And usually those thresholds or those barriers are a result of us seeing ourselves in the thing. So if I can see myself outside of the thing, and if I can open the door to more people to even just in the space of a 50-minute class to see themselves outside of the thing, then we can perhaps become infinitely more clear-eyed about what the thing is. So that kind of speaks to how I see the difference between constructionism and skepticism, but also as a tool, as a strategy, I think the differences matter because, some of us in this room, we've been in the game for a long time, you included, Roberto. Been in the game for a long time. We've been talking about racism, fighting against racism, all this other stuff. Some of us our entire lives, okay? And the reason why it's this constant, I feel like I'm hitting my head against the wall thing, is because we continue to try to address the issue from within the confines. And that's where skepticism becomes helpful, even if you're not persuaded. And yes, constructionists do have a healthy amount of skepticism, as they should. I think some people might think they're constructionists because we're sort of defaulted into that position. We're not even told necessarily about skepticism in the first place. So I think many of us in this room, we might actually find ourselves to be skeptics, like full-blown skeptics, like Dr. May's skeptic. And yet, because we don't have the language for it, because we don't have the knowledge of what skepticism is, because we don't even know that's a thing, right? We just think there's two ways to think about race. We wouldn't necessarily know it and be able to identify it for ourselves, which is step one, and never mind being able to help anyone else really grapple with or understand or get outside of it as well. If there's time, how much time do we have for questions? Is there a hard stop?
Can I follow up with another one?
Yeah, sure.
Sorry, quick, to then, moving into the what do we do, right, in this long history of work. Can you sort of speak a little bit, because the theory of racelessness uses this language of a belief and choice, right? So the language, the words that came up in the slides, right? And those are very individually based, right? Individuals hold beliefs, individuals make choices. So where are institutions in your theory, right? So for example, right, we can see the continuation of racism in, for example, the voting suppression that is a quite raceless language, right? So taking away, for example, ballot boxes in communities of color for people, to drop in their their vote by mail, right? So this is what's happening, right? These ballot boxes are being sort of taken down or reducing the number of voting precincts, right? It creates longer lines that incentivize people from voting, right? So this is really, right, is at this really, small kind of level, right? That the language is not really about choice or beliefs. It's just really reducing the amount of access that people have to exercise their right to vote in this, right, very mundane kind of policies, right? I'm gonna close down voting precincts, I'm gonna shut down ballot boxes, I'm gonna take away voting by mail because alleged, inconsistencies in elections, right? So all these things are, done in a non-racial language, but they have a clear effect in communities of color in terms of the right to vote, right? So where are the institutions in the theory of racistness that go beyond individual choice and or belief?
So one aspect that I contend that anti-racism misses more often than not is the fact that systemic racism includes beliefs and knowledge. Knowledge systems, right, belief systems, these are fundamental aspect of any human society. So in our education system, we are defaulted into one of the first four philosophies of race. And as a result of that defaulting, then some people would feel very comfortable with the type of prejudice that you're describing happening, because if I see you as subhuman, or if I see you as not human at all, or less than, right, then I can feel comfortable with the discrimination. So we can't have our cake and eat it too. We have to be solving the root cause of the problem, which I contend is the knowledge and the belief system, which then gets used to justify and maintain the systemic problems that you're talking about. We have to be able to solve that at the same time that we are addressing the type of instances that you're describing. Because alternatively, we can do what we've been doing, which is most of us unintentionally maintain racism through the knowledge and the belief system, through the media, our education system, and our government. We can keep doing that, right? And then we can come on the back end and try to solve the symptoms caused by racism. Or we can address the symptoms simultaneously as we're getting to the root cause of the problem. I do think that it comes down to each of us deciding, more clearly and definitively, what is it that we want? And because I'm of the mindset of recognizing the individual's place in any system in the first place, right? Like systems don't exist outside of the individual, and collectives, communities don't exist without the individual. It's all, to me, interconnected. But if we continue to ignore the role that in the power, the influence of the individual in ways that lock individuality up with whiteness, for example, and collectivism up with blackness, we need to be able to free all of those things, because the reality is gray. The reality is both and, right? And is it possible to identify the kinds of practices or policies and procedures that you're describing without using the language that I'm saying is part of the problem? Yes, because I would contend that it's largely economic class issues that you're describing. And as much as in America we come to conflate blackness with poverty, if we know the numbers, it's not an accurate reflection of what is happening in underserved communities. And if we can decouple that, and if we can address economic class issues, regional issues, which also plays a role in the whole economic piece, right? Like your zip code matters a sort of inordinate amount in the United States. If we can decouple all of those fundamental problems in order to address the same problems that you're talking about, then I would say let's get creative and figure out how to solve those problems without still maintaining the thing that's causing the problems. Oh, I will also say this for those of us in this room, myself included, this might be a really challenging concept, like a really challenging framework. Different aspects of it are going to challenge you, right? Which, hey, I think that's what education is supposed to be. But if we get it right for future generations, if we get it right in K through 12, it doesn't have to be like this always, right? We don't have to continue the whole rigmarole of introducing the theory of racistness forever and always, right? Because if in K through 12, we stop teaching kids to default themselves into the categories of race in the first place, we have elementary schools still teaching kids that there are 5 biological races of human beings, which, I mean, that to me is like so nefarious, because modern science has disproven that, right? So why are we teaching our kids that there are 5 biological races? And then at some point they get to high school, certainly if they go to college, then we start changing the language from it's biological, it's natural, to it's a construction. And that to me is also a shortcoming of constructionism too, because you scratch a constructionist and you find a biological realist, right? That's what makes it that much harder for people to contend with their belief in race, because fundamentally we might say it's made up, but we believe it's biological. We believe it's biological because we're taught in the United States that it is biological. And then nobody comes and rectifies or remedies or undoes that biological belief, but then we just start calling it a construction. And almost never do you get introduced, hey, there's a third way to see this, right? Skepticism. And in the same way we get defaulted into what to do with race. We get defaulted into conservationism, or we get defaulted into reconstructionism, and almost never does anyone come and say, hey, there's a third way to look at this, right? It's again about exploding the categories. I mean, full stop, just like fully exploding the sort of black and white, us, them, neat and tidy, this or that, to explore and mind what I call in the book, the twilight space, the gray space, the in-between space, so that we can see more clearly the sides, right? And we can see more clearly alternative paths forward. And if we get it right for, again, our future generations, then the road will be a lot easier, but we have to be able to educate people and I guess persuade people in that direction, which I think is possible. But is it hard work? Oh my gosh, yeah, I'll be the first to tell you. Very hard work, but it's necessary as I see it. So Sarah left, so yes, Dr. Wambui.
Okay, good afternoon, and thank you for your presentation. I'd like to follow up on Professor Rincon's question. So you take the position of being a skeptic, and I'd like a clarification, and then I'll come back. So you're skeptical of the concept of race, but not of the impact, the material impact. So Professor Rincon was discussing the material impact, yes? Or water in Mississippi, this past period, right?
Yeah,
I'm voting in Texas and Florida.
Mhm.
So is that material impact is real, but you're saying that race is not? Or what? Clear that for me, please.
Sure, thank you. It's so good to see you. So, yeah, I'm of the mindset, Toni Morrison has a quote, my favorite quote by her. She says that race is not real anthropologically or biologically.
Right.
Racism is a social construction. So I see racism as a social construction. Racism is what has the material impact, right? Not race. And for me, the distinction matters for a lot of reasons that I won't digress into, but the distinction matters because as so long as we continue to misdirect our focus and interrogation away from racism toward race, in the language of race, then we continue to let racism go unaccounted for in ways that for me are problematic.
So where do you situate your position given the histories that emerge, theoretical histories? So the analysis, such as the constructivist analysis, is a response to universalism. So this idea that, you know, all are the same, that emerges out of modernity, that excludes people of color and women and trans bodies and disabled bodies. And in response to that, we begin that critique, Omi and Winat, right? That takes care of the fiction and the reality, this invitation to see both. Where do you situate yourself given this history? So are you taking us back to modernism?
Oh, I'm not taking us back anywhere. No. We've never tried skepticism and we've never tried eliminativism ever in the history of this entire country. It probably hasn't been tried, admittedly, in any country, but certainly not in this country. We've never tried that. So part of what I'm hearing when you're talking about universalism is also some of the critique that comes out of humanism. So I kind of see parallels there. I see my work as fundamentally humanist, but without all of the problems and baggage, right? People forget that the whole entire continent of Africa, there's humanism there, right? It's this fundamental embracement of human differences, right, whether it be how we look, whether it be what we eat, the clothes we wear, the languages we speak, where we live, etc. Right? That right now, some people are precluded from actually seeing, acknowledging, and embracing. On a fundamental level, if we can free ourselves from the strictures of racism, from the black and white, we will be infinitely more clear about and have proliferated understandings about culture, ethnicity, you know, phenotype, DNA, all of those things. I actually see the limitation as being part and parcel of the practice of racialization and the embracement and upholding of the belief in race. So long as we continue to believe in those things, I think, you know, while universalism and humanism, as we've described it and as we understand it, have been fallen short for a lot of reasons that I think are apparent, the shortcomings of the current trajectory or effort to help center the humanity of people who are unlike oneself, the falling short is a result of our strategies for how we're getting there. It's a result of insisting that people, even as we're trying to interrogate the different boxes that we can check for our identities, we're being encouraged to see ourselves only in or primarily in those identities. And when you recognize that those identities were created to create and maintain hierarchies of various sorts, whether it be gender or sexuality or race, etc., then it seems intuitive that the way that we help more people out of it, not 100% of people are going to be persuaded, but how we help more people out of it to be more clear-eyed and understanding and embracing of human differences is to get outside of the apparatus, not to ignore that the apparatus is there, right? Like, we're going to acknowledge the problem of racialization, which creates the fiction of race, which means that people see me as a racialized Black person in this country, right? We're not ignoring anything. We're not glossing over anything. We're just doing that analytical work from outside of the thing. And in seeing oneself outside of the thing, there are also benefits that haven't come up yet, like the fact that I don't make myself the cause for other people's ignorance or violence. As it stands, so I'm the L in LGBTQ+, right? As it stands, until very recently, I used to tell myself, if I went into a space with my wife and our children, that this person's side eye or, glance, or how, they call my wife my friend, that's a common way to be dismissive, right? That ignorance or that bias is because I am how I am, because I love who I love. And with racism, we do the language, we do the fighting against it in the same way. This happens because I'm Black. Breonna Taylor was killed because she's Black. George Floyd was murdered because he's Black. We make the cause for the violence race. And fundamentally, the creators of the violence, the actors of the violence, the enactors of the violence are missing from the equation. And I see the primary way of solving that, rectifying that, is by stepping outside of it entirely to see that. And some people resist that seeing because they see themselves in the category. So in terms of strategy, if we want more people to see more clearly, right, to be more embracing of diversity instead of just preaching about diversity, right? I would submit that you don't have to look very far to see how we're doing things isn't working. It's not working for most of the population. It's not working. And so what do we have to lose to get outside of it, to do the same analytical work? It's the same history. I didn't invent the history. It's the same history, right? I'm just using different language. I'm outside of it. I have different rules, so we're clear-eyed about it. But it's the same. It's the same work that your department's likely doing, right? It's the same work that I was trained to do. Yes.
Thank you so much for the talk, and I'm finding it super challenging, and I'm thinking a lot about what you're saying. And I think a lot of what I find challenging maybe comes from my perspective as a historian, because we are very trained into the constructionist theory. But I guess just from what you were saying just now, one of the things that I was really struggling with is if we were to follow your theory, where is the language that we can have to say, to talk about the white violence?
To talk about the what?
The white violence, the examples that you were just giving, I want a language to talk about white responsibility for slavery and white responsibility for the murders that you were talking about. But if I lose the language of race, then how can I talk about that?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It makes sense.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you for your question. So remember earlier in the presentation, I said, I'm not saying that we need to skip to the good part.
Yes.
So that language doesn't go anywhere. You're just using it differently in a way that doesn't uphold and reify the category and naturalize it. So in the first chapter, I talk about whiteness and Blackness and what it meant to be a free person of color and all that other stuff, historical stuff, right? I talk about all of that. except I just used some strategies that helped me avoid redefining it. Some of those strategies in the first book, at that stage of my journey, I was saying racialized as white or racialized as black. I was putting racialized in front of it. In my second book, I've pushed my language a bit further, and now I'll say a person who is racialized as fill in the blank, because I'm centering and putting the human first, and I'm showing that something external that's inherited, right, and then internalized happens based on the context of that person and based on the time period. Now, because I'm doing this analytical and historical work from outside of the confines, we can then be clear that, hey, whiteness is a metaphor in a lot of significant ways. It's a metaphor for individuality. It's a metaphor for supremacy, right? It's a metaphor for all of these things. And in the same way, blackness is a metaphor for all of these things. But because we're talking about it as a sort of metaphor, we're able to bring more people into the room, to bring more people to the table, to actually talk about the problems, to talk about how these ideas were conjured, right, and practiced and enacted and imposed onto people. But we're just doing it from outside of the confines, which makes a difference, because 50% of the population, at least in the US, are fighting against anti-racism and what they're calling CRT, right? I mean, we have people who are fundamentally opposed to anything that looks like CRT or anti-racism. Why? Because they're being forced to operate within the framework of race, right, to racialize themselves. And we know that historically speaking, whiteness has been conflated with racistness in really problematic ways, invisibility, all of that stuff. So how do we open the door to more people to actually stop the problems that we care about? We do the analytical work from outside, but it's the same in my mind. I kind of chuckle because it's the same analytical work. I'm just using different language to describe the same thing, right? And I'm inviting other people to come on that journey with me, because people don't run away from the theory of racistness, but they do run away from what they think is CRT or anti-racism. And in terms of strategy, because of my sincere desire to help as many people stop the cause and effects of racism as possible, I do think that strategically it matters who we're opening the door to. Yes, Dr. Wabui.
So we go.
Oh, Renee, you're back. I'm sorry. Yes, Renee.
So as a future educator, how should we teach these historical events to students with the idea of racelessness in motion?
How? Well, okay, so I guess this is probably a good, I think this is probably a good place to say that I am one person, and as brilliant as I am, I'm brilliant. I need help, in this work. This is an invitation that I'm extending to everyone in this room. Whatever your field is, whatever your discipline is, to engage with the theory, and then do your own thing in your own realms, right? In your own sectors, in your own industries, et cetera, in your own relationships. Because as a single person, as much as I've developed the work and continue to develop the work, I only get to continue developing if by collaborating with other people and other, thinkers about this thing. There's no short answer I can give you, Renee, except for the fact that when I'm talking about using different language to do the analytical work as it pertains to racism historically in the classroom, we can do that analytical work, again, from outside the confines of the same thing that we're analyzing to see the fishbowl more clearly. We can be in the ocean while we're looking at the fishbowl. And I have some strategies in my book, which I'm happy to share with you in terms of what I do with language to help stop unintentionally upholding these problems. And I work with people who work with, K through 12th graders in this space to help them not unintentionally continue the problem of racism. So there's definitely work that exists out there. And as I have resources, they will be your resources, Renee. We will stay connected. I'm working with people even more explicitly on curriculum in particular, not just for higher ed, but also K through 12. Yes.
So we have one more question.
Sure. Right. Hi, so good to see you.
I'm glad you chose the cover that I voted for.
Yes. Thanks. Oh, I had my classes vote on the first book cover, and they all voted for the one that it ended up being.
But just really quickly, I hope it's not too personal of a question.
Sure.
But you mentioned that when you were 8 was when someone claimed that you were Black, and it turned out to be pretty destructive. So I'm just curious, I don't know if you had that conversation with your children yet, since they're only 3, but I'm just curious as to how you help them to identify themselves. And I don't plan to have kids, I might change my mind, but just in case, I'd like to know how to communicate that.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm so happy to see you. I think about this incessantly, as I would, because as you said, they are just 3, but I know the day is going to come, right? I think it's an error to think that we can raise our children to be ideologically neutral. So I'm going to lean into teaching them what I know and teaching them about my work and making sure that they understand the philosophies of race on a very, age-appropriate level as they grow. Because they'll come home and they'll say, somebody called me the N-word, right? They'll come home and they'll say, I'm Black, and like, what does that mean? And I'm going to tell them, the truth. I'm going to tell them the practice of racialization, like the belief in race, that this is typically what gets assigned to the different categories, but how do you see yourself, right? Who are you? Tell me in your own words who you are. And I think the combination of explanation and education along the way as they get older, and also invitation to give them space to articulate who they are in their own minds, I think just that, will go a long way. And then hopefully the work that I'm doing today will have had a bigger impact by the time they are much older, so that the fabric of society will also be changing along with them, so that it doesn't become this gargantuan task of constantly trying to fight being put in the fishbowl, trying to stay in the ocean. That can become really tiring, and understandably, a lot of people, they can get to a place of being over it. It's almost easier to just go with the current instead of against it. But my sincere hope is that they'll learn something from me, and that we can have the sort of honest and open conversations and discussions about how they see themselves, which I think is fundamentally the most important. Thank you all so much for your questions. That's all we have time for. The first QR code is a book. It's a book, Racecraft, The Soul of Inequality in American Life. Scan that if you want to download it, by Barbara and Karen Fields. The second is a worksheet inspired by today, so that you can reflect on your philosophies of race, etc., even after you leave. And then the last is if you want to go to my podcast, I have plenty of other resources for you to continue engaging and learning. Thanks again, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Don't forget, we do have some books for sale. So if you'd like, there's a lot of ideas that were articulated. You want to read the whole in-depth account in the book, please feel free to buy a coffee. Please hand in your comment cards into the box. There, we have a reception to follow. I think our speaker has earned some respite and some nutrition. And please look out for, we'll be having a spring 2023 speaker as well. So please, keep your radar open for that. But thank you very much, Professor Mason, and thank you everyone for
Thank you. Y'all are the real MVPs. You got to stay to the end.
If anyone is interested in getting a big credit, come on over.
Yes.
I'm so
It's fine.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh my
Oh, and I have a second one. Usually I take the thing and I forget to pay, you
Second year. But, you know, other than that, teachers. You know, both like, you know, stressed because like, work, but also better. How's your, I'm very impressed. I've heard all of the.
But they don't always come in, right?